Let me ask you something. You walked into a sewing machine dealer, you looked at the price tags and your stomach dropped. Or maybe you already own an expensive machine. A $2,000, $3,000, maybe even a $4,000 computerized model. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you keep wondering why your seams still pucker, why your tension still goes haywire on the first pass, and why the woman at your local quilt guild who sews on a 1970s mechanical Kenmore somehow produces work that looks cleaner and more polished than yours. I know that feeling. I have been there. And I want to talk to you honestly today about something that took me years at the sewing machine to fully understand. The machine is almost never the problem. Today, I am going to walk you through exactly what those mechanics are. I am going to give you a series of techniques, habits, and small investments that will transform the output of any machine you already own, budget or otherwise. And by the end of this, I want you to feel what I feel every single time I sit down to sew, which is confident, prepared, and completely in control of what I am making. We are going to cover a lot of ground, thread selection, and why the cheap stuff is actually costing you money in rework time. Tension, the real explanation, not the oversimplified version you have heard before. Needle science, because you are probably changing yours too infrequently and it is wrecking your fabric. The one presser foot that costs $12 and replaces 3 expensive specialty feet. How to use adding machine tape to achieve couture-level precision on any home machine. Seam finishing on a budget that will hold up better than an unfinished seam on a $3,000 machine. And I am going to save one technique for the end, a specific pressing and finishing trick that professional seamstresses use on tailored garments that most home sewers have never heard of. So stay with me, because that one alone is worth the entire video. Let's start with thread, because this is where most people quietly bleed money and quality without realizing it. If you are buying thread based on price per spool at the big box store, stop. I know that feels counterintuitive, especially if you are already watching your budget. But here is the mechanical reality. Cheap thread, and I am talking about your generic store brand polycotton blends, the ones that come in the jumbo value packs, is inconsistent in its thickness. It varies from thin to thick along the same strand, sometimes within just a few inches. Your tension discs are set to handle a specific diameter of thread. When that diameter fluctuates, your tension fluctuates. You will get a perfectly balanced stitch for 6 inches, and then a loop on the bobbin side, and then a pulled stitch on the top. And you will spend 45 minutes adjusting your tension dial when the problem is not your machine at all. It is your thread. The brands I trust and have trusted for years are Gutermann and Coates and Clark Dual Duty XP. Gutermann is a long staple polyester, and it runs consistently. That consistency is what your tension discs need. A large spool of Gutermann will run you around $4 to $6, depending on where you buy it. That is not cheap per spool, but when you stop ripping out seams and restarting, it is dramatically cheaper per finished inch of sewing. For cotton projects, quilting, apparel in natural fibers, anything where you want thread that behaves the way your fabric behaves, I use Aurifil 50 weight. It is thinner, it sinks into the fabric, and it presses flat in a way that cheap thread never does. Yes, it costs more. Yes, it is worth it. One large cone of Aurifil 50 weight will outlast 20 value packs of budget thread and produce better results every single time. Now here is something I want you to understand about thread weight that most beginner tutorials skip entirely. Thread weight is counterintuitive. The higher the number, the thinner the thread. So a 50 weight thread is thinner than a 28 weight thread. For most garment sewing and quilting, you want 50 weight. It is fine enough to create a nearly invisible seam. It reduces bulk in your seam allowance, and it behaves beautifully through a standard 80/12 needle. If you are getting thread nests, that bird's nest of tangled thread underneath your fabric on the first few stitches, it is almost never a tension problem. It is one of 3 things. Your presser foot is not down when you start sewing. Your upper thread is not seated properly in the tension discs, or you are not holding your thread tails back when you begin. I want you to develop a pre-sewing checklist. Presser foot down. Thread tails held back and toward you for the first 3 or 4 stitches. Upper threading confirmed through every guide. Do that every single time, and thread nests will become a memory. Let me talk about needles, because this might be the most underestimated variable. In home sewing, I know people who have been sewing for 20 years and change their needle once a season. That is like driving on the same tires for a decade and wondering why your car handles badly. A sewing machine needle begins to dull after 8 to 10 hours of sewing. On woven fabric, a dull needle does not cut cleanly through the threads. Of the weave, it pushes them aside and creates tiny distortions in the fabric surface, which you see as puckering, skipped stitches, and uneven tension. On knit fabric, a dull needle can actually cause runs, because instead of the ballpoint tip sliding between the loops of the knit, it is snagging them. I change my needle at the beginning of every new project, and I change it mid-project if I am working with something heavy or dense like denim or canvas. Here is the simple needle guide I want you to keep near your machine. For woven fabrics, quilting cotton, linen, shirting, use a universal needle in size 80/12. For lightweight silks and chiffons, drop to a 70/10 Microtex. For denim and heavy canvas, go to a 90/14 or 100/16 jeans needle. For any knit fabric, jersey, pont, interlock, use a ballpoint or stretch needle in 75/11 or 80/12. Never use a universal needle on knit. It will skip stitches and snag your loops. The ballpoint tip is specifically engineered to go between the loops rather than through them, and it makes an enormous difference. Schmetz and Organ are the 2 brands I trust completely. A pack of 10 Schmetz needles costs about $8. That is $8 that will save you hours of troubleshooting. Now I want to get into tension, and I mean really get into it, because the standard explanation, 8 is balanced, go higher for tighter, lower for looser, is almost useless without context. Here is how tension actually works. Your sewing machine creates a stitch by looping the upper thread around the bobbin thread in the middle of the fabric layers. For a perfectly balanced stitch, that connection point, that interlocking loop, should sit exactly in the center of the fabric, invisible from both the top and the bottom. When your upper tension is too tight, it pulls the bobbin thread up toward the top surface, and you see little dots of the bobbin thread color on the top of your fabric. When your upper tension is too loose, the upper thread gets dragged down to the bottom surface, and you see loops on the back. The bobbin tension is set at the factory and should rarely be adjusted, and never adjust it without marking your original setting with a paint pen first, so you can get back to it. Before you touch your tension dial for any reason, do this. Rethread your machine from scratch completely with the presser foot up. This is critical. Your tension discs only open to receive the thread when the presser foot is in the raised position. If you thread with the foot down, the thread never seats properly between the discs. Your upper tension is effectively 0, and you will get loops on the back of every seam. I cannot tell you how many times I have watched someone spend 20 minutes adjusting the tension dial when the entire problem was that they threaded the machine with the foot down. Raise the foot, rethread completely, lower the foot, test on a scrap of the same fabric you are sewing, and only then make micro adjustments to the dial. Move in increments of half a number at a time. Most balanced stitches fall between 3.5 and 5 on a standard dial. Here is something else that affects tension that nobody talks about: the age and condition of your bobbin case. If you are using a plastic bobbin in a machine that was designed for metal bobbins, your tension will be inconsistent. If your bobbin case has a nick or a burr on the edge, which you can check by running a fingernail around the opening, it will catch the thread and create drag that mimics tension problems. Clean your bobbin case every 3 to 4 bobbins. Use a small, dry brush. I use a dedicated watercolor brush. And remove lint from the race and the feed dogs. Do not use canned air, because it pushes lint deeper into the machine. A clean, lint-free bobbin case is doing more for your stitch quality than any tension adjustment you will ever make. Now I promised you I would talk about presser feet, and specifically about the one $12 foot that replaces 3 expensive specialty feet. But I also want to build up to that properly, because understanding why you need it requires understanding what your standard presser foot is actually doing wrong. So let me plant that seed right now and tell you, we are getting there. And when we do, it is going to make a lot of things click into place. First, I need to talk to you about something that every intermediate sewer hits eventually, and it has to do with seam allowances and precision. Because precision is where a budget machine operated correctly will always beat an expensive machine operated carelessly. The most powerful precision tool I have ever used at a sewing machine costs less than $2. It is adding machine tape. It is that narrow paper tape that used to go in old-fashioned calculators, and you can still find it at office supply stores or online for almost nothing. Here is what you do with it. Before you cut a single piece of fabric for a new project, you trace your pattern pieces onto adding machine tape, marking every notch, every seam line, and every grain line. You use the tape as a placement and checking tool along your seam guide. You can also cut strips of it and adhere them to your throat plate with a tiny piece of low-tack tape to create a custom seam guide at any measurement you need. On older machines that do not have a built-in seam guide, this is transformative. On newer machines, it gives you a tactile edge to run your fabric against, which is more reliable than watching a line on the throat plate. I use adding machine tape for another purpose that quilters especially need to hear. When I am chain piecing quilt blocks, sewing a long series of small pieces one after another without cutting the thread between them, I use a strip of adding machine tape as a leader and ender. A leader is a small folded scrap of fabric you sew onto before your actual pieces, and an ender is the scrap you sew onto after. This prevents thread nests at the start of each seam and keeps your thread from being pulled down into the machine at the beginning of a chain. Adding machine tape works even better than fabric scraps as a leader because it is stiff enough to feed smoothly. It does not fray, and you can use the same strip dozens of times. It sounds like a tiny thing. It is not a tiny thing. It saves you from rethreading and from thread nests, which means you are spending your time sewing instead of troubleshooting. Here is chunk 2, approximately 2450 words. Let me come back to presser feet now, because I have set up the context, and I want to give you the full explanation. The foot I am talking about is the walking foot, sometimes called an even feed foot. If you do not own one, stop this video after it ends and go order one. You can find a generic version compatible with most low-shank machines, which covers the vast majority of Brother, Singer, and Janome home machines, for $10 to $15 on Amazon or at your local sewing shop. The Bernina version costs over $100. The generic version does the same mechanical job. Here is what a walking foot does and why it matters. Your machine has feed dogs, those little toothed tracks under the presser foot that move your fabric forward as you sew. Feed dogs work from below. They grip the bottom layer of your fabric and advance it. But your standard presser foot sits on top and does not actively move. It just applies pressure. This means the bottom layer of your fabric is being fed forward by the feed dogs, but the top layer is being dragged along passively. On a single layer of quilting cotton, this is usually fine, but the moment you add batting, the moment you are sewing 2 layers of slippery fabric together, or the moment you are trying to match a plaid or a stripe across a seam, that discrepancy in feed rate between the top and bottom layer causes shifting, misalignment, and what quilters call walking, where your top and bottom layers end up at different lengths at the end of a seam, because the bottom fed slightly faster than the top the whole way through. A walking foot has its own set of feed dogs on the top. It actively grips and advances both the top and bottom layers at the same rate. It is the single most impactful foot attachment for quilters doing straight-line quilting, for anyone sewing matching plaids or stripes, for anyone working with velvet or fleece, or any fabric that shifts under a standard foot. And because it feeds both layers evenly, it also dramatically reduces the puckering you get on slippery fabrics, like silk charmeuse or satin, because those fabrics shift the most under a standard foot. On a $3,000 machine with a standard foot, you will still get shifting on difficult fabrics. On a $300 machine with a walking foot, you will not. The foot is the difference, not the machine. The second foot I want you to own is a 1/4-inch foot, specifically for quilting. Most quilting instructions assume a precise 1/4-inch seam allowance. If your 1/4-inch seam is consistently off, by even a 1/16 of an inch, it compounds over every seam in a quilt block. By the time you have sewn 12 seams in a 12-block quilt, you are off by 3/4 of an inch, and your blocks will not lay flat and will not match at the intersections. A dedicated 1/4-inch foot has a physical guide on the right side that you run your fabric edge against. It removes the guesswork entirely. You can find these for $8 to $12 for most standard machines. It is $8 that will fix a problem that no amount of expensive machine features can compensate for. The third foot, and I want you to get this one too, is a zipper foot. Specifically, a narrow zipper foot, rather than the wide standard one that comes with most machines. A narrow zipper foot lets you sew closer to the zipper teeth or to a piped cord, and it gives you significantly more visibility of what is happening directly at the needle. Most machines come with a zipper foot, but it is often the wide version. The narrow version costs around $8, and it will change the way you install invisible zippers. And so piped cushion covers and bags. 3 feet, total investment under $40. And they cover 90% of the specialty sewing situations that drive people to buy expensive machines in the first place. Now I want to talk about seam finishing, because this is where a budget machine can either look completely professional or completely amateur, and it has nothing to do with the machine itself. A seam finish is what you do to the raw edges of your seam allowance to prevent fraying. On a $3,000 machine with a built-in overlocker function, this is handled automatically. On a budget machine, you are going to do it manually, and when you understand the options, you will realize you are not actually missing much. The first option is the zigzag finish. Set your machine to a medium width, medium-length zigzag and stitch along each raw edge of your seam allowance, just inside the cut edge. Trim close to the zigzag after stitching. This is fast, it is effective on most woven fabrics, and it is available on every machine that does zigzag, which is essentially every machine made in the last 40 years. The limitation of a zigzag finish is that it can still allow some fraying on very loosely woven fabrics, and it adds a little bulk to the seam allowance. For those situations, I use a Hong Kong finish, which sounds fancy and is completely simple. You cut thin bias strips of lining fabric, about 1 inch wide, and you wrap each raw edge of the seam allowance with a strip, stitching it in place. The result is a completely enclosed raw edge, zero fraying, and it looks like something out of a Parisian couture workroom. It takes more time than a zigzag, but on a tailored jacket or a structured skirt where you will be pressing the seams open and the inside of the garment will be visible, it is worth every minute. On quilts and projects where seams are enclosed and pressed to one side, you do not need any seam finish at all. The layers of the quilt hold the seams in place, and the batting and backing prevent fraying. This is why quilters do not need an overlocker, despite what some marketing will try to tell you. Let me talk about pressing now, because it is the single most overlooked technical skill in home sewing, and it is completely free to do correctly. Ironing and pressing are not the same thing. Ironing is moving the iron across the fabric in long strokes to remove wrinkles. Pressing is placing the iron, applying pressure, lifting, and moving. When you iron a seam, you risk stretching it, especially on bias cut edges or knit fabrics, because you are physically moving the iron across the fabric while it is hot and temporarily pliable. When you press a seam, you are setting it in place without distortion. Press every seam before it crosses another seam. This is the fundamental rule of garment sewing and quilting precision. If you sew two pieces together and then cross that seam with another seam without pressing first, you are sewing over a lump of unset fabric, and your seam allowances will be going in random directions inside the work. When you press first, your seam allowances are flat and deliberate, and your intersections will be sharp. Now here is the finishing trick I promised you at the beginning, and this is the one that professional seamstresses use on tailored garments that most home sewers have never encountered. It is called understitching, and combined with a technique called edge pressing using a seam roll, it produces a finished edge, a neckline, an armhole, a facing, a collar that lies perfectly flat without any of the facing rolling to the outside of the garment. Here is how it works. After you stitch a facing to a garment and trim and clip the seam allowance, before you flip the facing to the inside, you understitch. You press all the seam allowances toward the facing, and then you stitch through the facing and the seam allowances together, very close to the seam line, about 1/8 of an inch away. When you flip the facing to the inside and press, that row of understitching prevents the facing from ever rolling forward to show on the outside of the garment. It locks it in place mechanically. No hand stitching required, no catch stitching, no fusing. Just one straight line of machine stitching that you will never see on the finished garment. The edge pressing with a seam roll adds another layer of refinement. A seam roll is a tightly rolled, cloth-covered tube. You can buy one for $10, or you can make one by rolling a thick magazine tightly and wrapping it in a piece of muslin. You press your seams over the curved surface of the seam roll, which means only the seam itself is in contact with the iron. The seam allowances fall away on either side and do not get pressed into the surface of the garment, which would create a visible ridge on the right side. This is exactly how tailors press seams on wool trousers and structured jackets. The seam lies perfectly flat on the right side with no shadow of the seam allowance showing through. You can do this on a $289 machine. You cannot buy your way into this result with a more expensive machine. It is a technique and it is yours right now. I want to spend a few minutes on thrifting and buying second-hand machines, because this is where the real value multiplication happens, and where I have had some of my best experiences as a sewer. The vintage mechanical sewing machine market is one of the most accessible gold mines in the fiber arts world. I am talking specifically about the Singer 201, the Singer 15-91, the Burnett 35, and the Janome 415, machines made between roughly 1950 and 1990, built with all-metal internals, simple mechanical tension systems, and a straight stitch that is mechanically cleaner than what most modern budget machines produce. The Singer 201 in particular has a reputation among serious sewers as one of the finest straight-stitch machines ever manufactured for home use. Have seen them go for $30 to $80 at estate sales and on Facebook Marketplace. A good cleaning, a new needle, and fresh oil in the appropriate spots. You will find a lubrication diagram for any vintage Singer by searching the model number and lubrication guide. And you have a machine that will sew through 6 layers of denim without flinching. What to look for when buying second-hand. First, confirm the machine runs. Bring a power cord if it is one that was potentially stored without one. Listen for grinding or a high-pitched squeal, which usually indicates a motor that needs servicing or dry bearings. A low hum and smooth needle movement is what you want. Check the tension by sewing a test seam on a folded piece of cotton scrap. Carry a small piece with you when you go to look at a machine. Check that the feed dogs move smoothly and consistently. Check that the bobbin loads without resistance. The mechanism for this varies by machine, top loading versus front loading versus side loading. But in every case, the bobbin should drop in and turn freely without catching. Skipped stitches on a vintage machine almost always mean needle needs replacing or the timing has slipped very slightly. Timing adjustment on a vintage Singer is a 10-minute job if you watch one tutorial on your specific model. It is not frightening once you do it once. For budget new machines, the two I recommend Without hesitation are the Brother CS6000i, which sells for around $170 to $200 on sale, and the Janome 2212, which is a mechanical, no-frills machine that runs for about $150 and is virtually indestructible. The Brother CS6000i has a wide stitch selection, a built-in walking foot mode using its even feed system, and a free arm feature for sewing sleeve cuffs and trouser legs. The Janome 2212 has fewer stitches but a stronger motor for its price class, and a bobbin system that is remarkably smooth and easy to maintain. Neither of these machines will impress anyone at a guild meeting. Both of them will produce professional quality seams in the hands of someone who understands thread, tension, needles, pressing, and presser feet. I want to close with something I feel strongly about because I have been sewing long enough to have watched a lot of people fall into the trap I am describing. The sewing machine industry, like the camera industry, like the bicycle industry, like many equipment-based hobbies, benefits enormously from the belief that equipment is the limiting factor in your results. A $3,000 machine does have real advantages. The stitch quality on the very high-end mechanical and electronic models is genuinely excellent. The automatic thread cutter saves time. Some of the presser foot sensing technology is impressive. I am not pretending those things do not exist. What I am telling you is that those advantages are marginal compared to the advantages that come from understanding your craft at a mechanical and technical level. A person who understands thread behavior, tension mechanics, needle science, pressing technique, and seam finishing will outsew a person who does not, regardless of what either one of them is sitting in front of. The goal of every video I make, every workshop I teach, and every project I share is to put that understanding in your hands. Because once it is there, it stays. You can bring it to any machine, any fabric, any pattern, any project. It does not go obsolete. It does not need a software update, and it does not cost $3,000. If you have a growing fabric stash, a scrap pile that makes you feel guilty every time you open the closet, or a machine you are afraid to push too hard, I want you to know that everything you need to make something beautiful is almost certainly already in that room with you. You just need the knowledge to use it. That is what this channel is for. I will see you in the next one.